Hello, welcome to Convergent Dialogues. This is Xavier Bonilla. On this episode, I'm talking with Clayton Bohnet. Clayton is currently a student of law at Cleveland Marshall College of Law. He's also been a professor at Central Washington University. He's been a professor at Gonzaga University. He's taught at Fordham. He has a PhD in philosophy from Duquesne University, and he has a master's in psychology. So as we talk about kind of in the beginning of the conversation, he's kind of done the humanities, and law is kind of fit in there too. Psychology, philosophy. He's got law, so he's just got this really nice mix of educational background and experience. And he wrote a book called Towards the Philosophy of Protest, which was very interesting, very fascinating. I really enjoyed reading it. And so that's what we talk about. So the book is used as, he has it in the form of a montage. And so he explains extensively what is a montage and then why he used montage for the book on protest, which was really, really fascinating to listen to him explain it. We talk about what is protest, so some kind of working definition of sorts. We talk about some of the functionality of what protests are. We talk about protest as spectacle. We talk about the difference between protests and mobs and riots. We talk about Kant's contribution to understanding critique and protest. And, we throughout the conversation, it becomes pretty clear, I think maybe middle of the conversation or so, that him and I disagree on a few things, which is always great. I actually find it kind of boring to just agree with people all the time. And so, not that I'm looking for disagreement, but it's really nice to engage with people that think differently and to try and understand and to learn from them. And so, that's what I had in this conversation. Obviously we see some differences on the utility of protest in 2023 at this point. We have some disagreements on, riots, protests and riots and how they can, it can become more extreme. And we have a nice exchange though. He was very generous. He was very nice with me. I was, very nice with him. And we're just trying to understand, where are you coming at this from? And okay, what makes sense here? And so, I have thought a lot about protests just generally. Obviously, the past couple of years, we've seen a little bit more of that. And so I was really excited to talk to him about protests because he's very thoughtful. He's obviously very, very, very smart. He's very brilliant. And so he's really been thinking about these things in a lot of ways and has a really nice passion about it. And so it's just really wonderful to talk to him about this. And I hope everyone enjoys listening to his conversation. As always, you can find this conversation and other past conversations at my free Substack at convergentdialogues.substack.com. So give me a follow there, and you can listen to all the conversations. And so now I bring you Clayton Bohnet. I'm here with Clayton Bohnet. Clayton, thank you so much for coming on the podcast. I'm looking forward to talking to you.
You're very welcome. It's really cool to be here.
Yeah, of course. Yeah. So I'll say right up front, we have a mutual friend in David Howinski, who's a good friend. He's a good guy. And he was like, yeah, you got to talk to Clayton. And I said, okay. So I've read your book. It's very good. It's very interesting. And I'm excited to talk to you about it. Before we get into it, just tell listeners your kind of your potted kind of biography, I guess, professionally. So what's your background's in, what you study, and what you currently write and think about.
Okay. I don't really have a prefabricated one, actually. I've tried to let go of that. But so I did a master's in psychology in an existential, phenomenologically oriented psychology department.
Nice.
And from there, I was not able to feel confident enough to be a therapist. Mm-hmm. So the move to philosophy after that. I did my doctorate degree at Duquesne University, studied the history, but largely late or high modern, like Kant, Hegel, German idealist stuff, phenomenology, a little Lacan, and some homo, so sort of leaning on the continental to the extent that one buys into those sort of compartmentalizations.
Sure.
But obviously there's something to them. I did my dissertation on Kant and Hegel and the philosophy of logic. I was trying to dialogue transcendental logic with formal logic in Kant and Hegel, and that was to various degrees a disaster, but an attempt. So after my doctorate degree, I taught at Fordham University for a little bit, and then I got a 3-year at Gonzaga that led to the abyss, but I was salvaged from the abyss to a certain extent by a position at the University of Central Washington State. And from there, for various and sundry reasons, I have retired into law school at this time. And so it's very interesting revisiting this material with a mind suddenly submerged in a different discipline in the study of law. And obviously, there's a lot I could have done in this text on the First Amendment, and like that I didn't do because, in a certain way, it was outside of the field of my research, like outside of the field of my palette, if you will. So, anyways, and it was when I was at Gonzaga that I was approached by the undergrads to give a little talk on protest. I was teaching an aesthetics class, and I was using T.V. Reid's The Art of Protest, where he's going through the various ways that art functions to facilitate resistance movements, protest movements. And the way that it facilitates a people, a community becoming a people in revolt, like the function of art to inaugurate or mobilize a people. Reid's book is very, very nice. And so anyways, I was teaching that in the aesthetics class, and then the students who were also members of other organizations asked me to do this keynote on protest, and then I just started writing. That's so right now, I'm studying law. I'm trying to figure out a way to not talk about John Locke and his importance for the tort law system. I'm trying to find a way to just study law.
Right. Well, your evolution is interesting. Psychology to philosophy to law. To be honest, I mean, it's not that different. I mean, there's a lot of overlap with a lot of that stuff. So I mean, you're very well rounded.
In the humanities, though, like I've tended to start to think of law as just like a vestige of an expression of the humanities still, in some way. But I'm not sure about that.
So the book is interesting. You talk about it actually quite at length a little bit in the beginning of saying how the format, how you organize the book. You say that it's a montage. So I wasn't really familiar with this. So explain to us just in general what a montage is, and then why you decided to go about this topic, on protest and other dissent and other things like that. But why did you decide to use the montage kind of structure to discuss this topic?
I think the easiest answer is that in that same aesthetics class, we were reading Walter Benjamin, and I was reading his work of art in the age of mechanical reproduction as a montage of sorts. And so I was mandating my students to write montages and to experiment with it as a mode of academic production. And how does this particular method undermine particular traditional forms of knowledge production? Like, how does knowledge under the methodology of montage, how is it lived differently than when one is writing an expositionary paper, right? Where you have your statement and you're developing it, you're providing evidence. It's a linear chronological exposition. Now, I think that it goes back to Evgeny Eisenstein. I think I got his name wrong, but Eisenstein in the working in film developed montage as an alternative. I was thinking about it earlier, an alternative way to make sense. Because in a sense, what montage did is allowed for the construction of sense through discontinuity, right? So you have this nice scene of, I mean, it's the cliche of the family eating, having a picnic, and then sliced in there is an image of a nuclear bomb going off, right? And so you have this capacity through juxtaposing images to create a sense or a meaning produced, and I shouldn't use those words interchangeably, but to produce a sense or a meaning that would likely not have arisen if one was constrained merely to a linear demonstrative discourse. So like, how does one produce knowledge in a way that subverts dominant discourses? And so when my students were encountering montage as a methodology, it was very difficult to compose discontinuities. But it asked them to think about the subject matter in a different way because you're using a different methodology. And so those students were the one who asked me to do this talk on protest. And so it just seemed my being influenced by Walter Benjamin and forcing it upon my students, it seemed to be in good faith to try to give this little keynote via the method of montage. And the keynote itself just kept being developed into a book the following summer, especially. I had a writing cabin for a couple months, and I had a good time doing writing and just focusing on it. I will also say, so montage functions by discontinuity. Okay. And we would also maybe want to say that it doesn't escape time altogether because, of course, you have prior and subsequent images interspliced. So you have a temporal unfolding that is at least narratively discontinuous. Now, it does seem that when one reads Benjamin, that it is not the case that the level of complexity of the discourse at the beginning is equivalent to the level of complexity at the end. That there's a difference. There's, I was trying to think about, if I could say this, an teleological telos. Because it's not, because if it's a montage, I think it must abide by the ideas of discontinuity. So if it's the telos is dangerous because it implies a singular arc through the course of the work of the composition. I think that what happens, what I fantasized about Benjamin's work, I can't be certain of it, is that it gets its most complicated. Like the peak of the writing is almost this conclusion where the irresolvable tension of that he's created in this work achieves its pinnacle expression. So my protest text was intended to be structured that way, that to work from what we might call the commonplace, or I don't want to say straightforward, but you're starting with a sort of common discourse. And then the fantasy, what I tried to do without forcing it, is to allow the fourth and final section of the text be the most aggravating in terms of production of irresolvable threads that are all, you feel like, for me, it's like I can feel the tension between these discrete elements, but the explication of their interconnection is not the work of the montage. The unpacking of it, the explanation. Montage is not an explanatory discourse. It's neither demonstrative nor explanatory, because in a sense, that sets up a particular relationship between the author and the reader. Of the knowledge is on the side of the author, and then it is sharing that or expressing and transmitting essentially this discursive game to the other. And that sort of unidirectional meaning is problematized by montage in surrealist works, in Eisenstein's films, and subsequently. And even in novels, right? The idea of the postmodern novel in a certain way is influenced by Montage to the extent that it's constituted by a series of abrupt cuts or slices of discourses and collaging suturing these discourses that are discontinuous to one another to ask the reader a question about meaning rather than to declare the meaning to the reader. So I think the subversion of Montage operates both at the level of the writer, because, and this is one thing that I should have said already, that there is an openness, I think, to accident in the production of Montage. And I think that that's one thing that kind of demonstrates its difference from elucidative discourses, insofar as like, for this text, I allowed the fact that all these protests happened. There's one part of the protest looks at a series of protests that happened during the span of 24 hours. And I selected some from around the world, and they all happened in those 24 hours were my mother's birthday. So it's like, it's accidental autobiographical intrusion into the research, so that it's not that I'm telling my story in this book. It's not an autobiography or something. It is, but it's still governed by the quote unquote personal or the idiosyncrasies of the researcher. That's why, in a certain way, a montage is unrepeatable. Nobody could do this protest montage. It's a thing. I don't know. I suppose all texts are singular, but I think Montage allows the caprice, the chance. It allows one's research to be governed not exclusively by outlines and premeditated programs of research. It allows for the spontaneous. And I found that, it's a more, it's different than writing a dissertation.
Sure.
Anyways.
Yeah, it feels like there's a free associative quality to it, like a very unconscious, uncovering kind of way. You set the frame, obviously, but that there's a way of letting it develop, which is really nice. And I think that probably wouldn't work for everything, but it does work for this topic, and as you kind of show in the book.
Well, I would wonder if I could. I don't see why that this methodology would be exclusively applicable to practical, like political or ethical. I honestly think that you could use Montage to construct an analysis or a surveillance of contemporary astrophysics. Like, there's nothing inherent to the method that demands it be applied to, I would say, a specific field rather than another. In fact, writing a montage on something like black holes or astrophysics in general might actually be very conducive to exploring alternative ways of thinking about concepts. So I think there is a virtue of Montage because you're forced to encounter concepts or theories that tend to be kept separate. And it allows a kind of forced compromise between discourses or conjectures that otherwise are worlds or academic departments apart.
I think maybe not specifically a montage, but there's elements of it. I think is Carlo Rovelli is a physicist, and his very short books kind of feel that way. It has a flavor to it. Maybe it's not exactly, but it has a flavor to it. Yeah, it makes for interesting, these big concepts. And again, he's been doing it forever, so he's kind of able to kind of be in that space, and it's interesting. It's very interesting. So tell us what is the protest, right? You talk about the whole book's about protest. It's a philosophy of protest. So what is a protest? How do you don't have to give me like the definition, but just how are you working with it? What it is. You talk about the etymology of it, where it comes from. So just kind of tell us, kind of key us up here for kind of the broad headline of protest and what it is.
Okay. Okay, anyway, there's a part of me that wants to continue the methodology question, but I can let that go. I think it's appropriate to let it go. So protest, I did like the etymology. I looked at a couple dictionaries so this was part one's discussion of protest. Was very rudimentary. It was meant to be elemental. Like what are the basic associated conceptual connections that exist in largely, now this is another shortcoming of the text, the largely Anglo-American dictionaries, right? So I could have pushed myself further to go into the history of the word protest in other languages and assess. That would have been really valuable. But I just focused on the West. Typical definitions, and then to the etymology. Obviously, typical definitions are referring to the existence of a political community that protest happens within a particular context. It's a phenomenon that happens that is contingent upon the existence of a particular political community with its own particular laws. Okay. Now, it is often described as objection. It's an objection to something that's happening in the name of the people. Like there's something's being done in our name and we don't like it and we don't like the way that the police are handling themselves, so we're going to express objection to that by occupying public space. And in the occupation of public space, constituting political speech. So protest is a form of political expression that presupposes a political community with a whole set of rules, etc. I think what was really interesting to me is, so if I do pro and test, okay, like I am not an etymologist by training, okay, so this is why I snuck it in the first part because it's supposed to be basic. So pro, I wanted to work in terms of futural. I think that what surprised me about thinking about protest was the temporality implied in it, right? So you could say, I mean, just to be facile, like something happens, there's some event that people perceive as unjust, and so they, in the name of justice, they go to the streets in the present, right? And ideally, not ideally, but just I think that the taking to the streets in the present to demand accountability for the wrong of the past is for the sake of the future where that sort of wrong doesn't happen anymore. Okay. And this is, as far as I could tell, completely coherent with, Aristotle's discussion of political speech as deliberative and futural oriented. It's about taking action. Sure. And so protest so it's a form of political expression, but it's also an activity that is a no saying to the status quo conduct of the police or something. And that in the present creates a solidarity between a community that is negating, that is actively in the present attempting to negate the behavior or the conduct that is at issue in the name of some future political community where those sorts of actions are not happening or are not guarded or insulated against. So protest does have this air of temporality and a seeking of accountability of elected officials or codes, legislative codes, regulations, protocols, right? So it's like who can be accountable. And so protest, interestingly, is sometimes addressed to particular individuals. And it's an objection to that individual's occupying that position of constituted power, that office, right? It's an objection to that person, wanting to negate that person's occupation of that place in the name of someone who will do what they ought to do. So you can I also got into this when I was doing the etymology that Protest is negation of the current state of affairs in the name of a conception of what ought to be. And so the future that we're trying to bring about in the engagement of protest is to allow the surpassing of what ought not to be in the name of what ought to be. I mean, it's simple. I mean, I think a lot of our actions are about that, right? I have these bad habits. I try to take action so that they are not the norm anymore, right? So that I'm closer or more proximate to being vegan or something, right? I'm taking these steps towards what I know ought to be in a certain way. Anyways,
let me ask a question here. So
I didn't get the test yet, but yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, so on the temporality piece of it, that makes a lot of sense. That makes a lot of sense. Maybe I'm getting ahead of so maybe you can do the test part, but I guess the question I have is I have a few questions actually, but I guess the one main thing is like the functionality of it. So
yeah,
there's if you take that there's something is going wrong or something has happened, you're in the moment, right, about something, a person or an entity or an institution or whatever has done something. Protest isn't just consciousness raising. It's not just making someone aware, although it's included in that. You're saying that there's a more active thing, but I guess my question with that is what specifically is the active ingredient for protesting? So if you take let me just take an example. There's a march or there's an actual like protest and event thing in the street or at a square or something like that. What's happening aside? Because I feel like the reception, maybe that's not important, but the reception is a handful of ways. People may be aware of it. But is anything going to really happen? Like there needs to be other things that happen. That's not to say that protest shouldn't, but it's at least a part of it. So maybe that's just its own lane or something like that. But I guess my question is, what is the functionality of sorts for protest?
Yeah. So in the book, I look at a couple discourses that are against protest. And that showcase the limitations of these sort of standard forms of protest, and emphasize the importance of participating in the local municipal governments processes as a form of activism. So it's like the sort of activist life in which protest or demonstrations, die-ins, self-immolations have their place. So I guess for me, the protest is necessary for many reasons. For God, like consciousness raising should not be neglected. I mean, it's taken for granted in a certain way that the virtue of protest is to make people who to bring it to the level of the national or global consciousness. That there's a problem and there's a significant demographic or trans-demographic segment of the population for whom this is very important. The existence of those in dissent are very important, I think, for movements and for individuals who otherwise would not have thought about themselves as having a perspective that is political, like who don't see themselves as political beings. Sometimes these protests help inaugurate in individuals a sense for their political calling or their political existence, right? Their insertion in a political milieu. So whether they agree with the protest or not, there's something about the thematization of the existence of ourselves as political animals.
Yeah.
So there, and that's not even just talking about the actual issue specific consciousness raising, whether it's like these people throwing mashed potatoes on plexiglass covered masterpieces to awaken at a global level awareness of or contribute to the ongoing gaining of awareness of the crisis condition of our reliance on fossil fuels and disposable culture.
I wanted to ask about that though, about the climate change thing, right? So like, if you're saying a protest, a march, a demonstration, or some of these other actions that happen in museums, those things are have less like salience in my mind, because it's like everybody on the planet experiences and knows about climate change. We don't need more awareness. I mean, there's the awareness is like it's terrible and it's bad and it's happening and we should do a better job of preventing it. But I don't think I need a march to say, oh man, wow, is that happening? I have no idea. Like, I think there's like maybe at one time, I mean, there's a big movement in the 60s that was really important, in each decade. And we had a big march, maybe, 7 years ago, that was maybe important, but now how relevant would that be when we know about it now? Like everybody knows about it. Nobody, unless you've been incarcerated for 30 years or something.
Well, I certainly do not want to reduce the youth movement and
Sure.
the protest movements of the contemporary age to redundancy.
Sure.
Certainly there's excessive frustration about the lack of connecting the so-called, as you're suggesting, the uniform or the voice of the people that is demanding dramatic changes to avert disaster.
Right.
I mean, to me, it is quite clear that the activists and environmentalists do not feel heard, that there is a gap between what politicians say and the legislation that actually takes place.
Sure.
It is not a foregone conclusion that the next administration will redo these rollbacks of environmental protections. It cannot be the case that we can. So I obviously I am still I am moved by the number of bodies that do protest for the sake of consciousness raising. And I do not think that I'm not saying this is what, I'm not in a position to say they're wrong. I mean, for God's sake, they're seeing the deafness of ears I don't want to be an anti-corporate, but I mean, that's the point here, is that corporate interest is the predominating factor in policy for environmental change.
Sure.
And so the only way we can basically get these environmental concerns to be binding is through constitutional amendments or the creation of, or working the environmental protections into already existing constitutional rights. So I think that consciousness raising about sexism, racism, classism is still a very relevant praxis, especially to the extent that one is expanding one's insulated media exposure. So like, to me, the question becomes, how do we, maybe this is a banal question, but like, to the extent that we have all of these algorithms that predict the news we would like to see and the stories we would like to read and which outlets we're getting them from and what social media posts we might be interested in. And the friends that we connect who are like us to the extent they share this values, who like other people who like us, so that the insulationist reality of the contemporary age is relatively stifling. And so I mean, we could argue about this, and sociologists and others would probably be better on this than I am. But for me, the virtue of the consciousness raising project of on the streets, occupying the commonplace of the polis, is still a radically potent vehicle for the political community, however that wants to be defined.
So let me push back on this a little bit, because I'm less convinced of that. So here's why. For at least two reasons. I think as time evolves and as look, I mean, you can't deny that people in mass going for a cause or going for something is a powerful image. It's a powerful statement. There's a lot of power in that, and literally power with people doing that. That's a wonderful thing. I guess my skepticism here is we live in 2023 essentially, and much of our interactions are digital. That's not to say that's the only way we interact, and I'm not making a value judgment on whether that's a good thing or bad thing. It should be, it shouldn't be. I'm just saying it is. We're very connected, and impact is going to be much more with where you're at, I think, digitally, what platform you're using, whatever. Again, not to say that physical protesting in a street is not impactful. I'm not saying that. I'm just trying to see effectiveness, I guess, is my yardstick here. The second thing about the kind of siphoning off of people's particular kinds of groups that they're in is so climate change is kind of easy in some ways because everyone kind of knows about it now. And of course, it's less about an awareness, in my opinion. It's more of action, right? Which is different, I think, and that's fair. That's fair. And I'm on this side of things, right? I agree. Climate change. I think we should do a cap and trade program at least. I mean, I'm very much aggressive on this stuff as well. But my thing is about the effectiveness of this. And when I talk to different people, I find overwhelmingly on this issue, it gets really saturated with a lot of these kinds of things, protests, demonstrations, maybe some of these actions in museums that happen. And it becomes almost like always there. So people don't have as much of a call to action as more of like oh yeah, there's another protest again about this thing I know about and I've been hearing about since 1962 or whatever. And there's a slight apathy. So for folks that are either climate denying, they're just not going to believe any of it, or for people that are maybe more politically conservative, they're going to have negative things to say about it, X, Y, and Z. Even if, let's say, in the United States, conservative governors or red states are actually doing some things for that, then you have even folks on the left that are going to say, yeah, we see this. We hear it all the time. Yeah. Okay, we see it. But, it sucks and it's happening. But what are these things what's going to happen? Speeches and rallies and protests is great. But kind of what you're saying, how do we get something in constitutional amendments? How do we get action? And I guess I'm more skeptical of, not that we shouldn't protest about it, but I would like to see, and then it's not to say it isn't happening, but more of that energy put at this point into pressuring. It might be behind the scenes. It might be, behind closed doors, pressuring people for making legislative changes, international, kind of co-opted things to try and do things, differently, getting in those rooms with heads of state. And again, I'm not saying that people aren't doing that, but if that was kind of the case, or, more of that energy was there, I guess in that way, it's like, okay, well, if a lot of people know about this, I mean, I would have to find someone that doesn't know about climate change or hasn't heard about it. And then, okay, is this protesting really pushing a call to action, or is it accountability, or in my mind, is this just a catharsis? It's just like yes, it sucks. We're all going to burn. Let's just get together and, let's make our voice heard. Not that that's wrong, but we've done that. And so I guess my thing now is is there a seasonal, or is there a time for some of these things? Now, you could say this is different for other concepts. So I'm not trying to make this a universal, right? We don't need more protests about sexism or racism or, certain discriminized groups. I'm not saying that. I'm saying on this issue in particular, it's not all equal, I would say. But just in this example, is there maybe a space where, how do we just navigate that more, effectively in some ways? So anyways, I gave you a lot. What are your thoughts?
So use Guy Debord in the text to talk about protest as spectacle. And I think that there's a level of, obviously, people go to the protest and it's part of being a spectacle. They're not, we could say that they're not engaged in organizing. They're not, it's almost like
the trendy thing.
A trendy thing. It's almost a form of tourism. Like, okay. But people go to the protest and the unexpected happens. The unexpected can happen still. And we see people who are organizing the protest, and we see them at work. And all of a sudden you see like a kind of beauty that you've never seen before, like the beauty of a sort of militant dedication to a cause, a commitment to a future, and that you're bearing that future is like you're faithful to that future. You're faithful to not what's not yet. And that inspires you, right? I mean, so even the person who's just going there for the spectacle so they can take a selfie of themselves at the protest can still be an insertion, a surprise insertion into a political community that you didn't know existed. So on the one hand, I want to say that, yeah, at the level of the spectacle, one positive function that protest has is to persuade. The virtue of the signs and the placards and the songs and the march itself, its starting point and its end, the whole thing is a semiotic that is trying to I wanted to say articulate a solidarity, a new solidarity. So in its articulations of itself, in its demands, in the articulations of what it holds as a grievance, the protest is seeking to persuade a public at large that and now you're going to refute this with regards to the environmental protections or these sorts of things, but I see protest as a function of persuasion insofar as it tries to use its spectacle nature to reach that consciousness raising level and to make that dialogue happen. So I think that even as a spectacle, it has value as part of the process of persuasion. Not the extent of, it's not the only vehicle of persuasion, but it has value within a larger context, most of which you've already mentioned, in terms of the dealing with the community meetings, the municipal governments, the state legislature, like all of that. To be an activist requires participation in a multitude of levels. It involves the legal profession. So I see protest as embedded within a larger, like, cultural political movement, and as necessary because it does bring different demographics, different classes, races together in opposition, in dissent from the status quo ordinary way of relating to police violence or tax havens or whatever, right? So now, protest as spectacle is precisely the protest that is planned in advance, right? A lot of you have to have a protest permit or a permit like 2 weeks in advance. Right. It has to be, everybody has to know about it. They can block off traffic. They can figure out how to not interrupt everybody's everyday life. We can all still make it to the soccer game, right? Protest isn't going to interrupt the ongoing flow of our everyday lives. Sure. And that's the spectacle protest. That's the protest at the airport that isn't clogging up the terminal, but is cordoned off essentially in this particular compartment. So you have the protest as spectacle, as capable of consciousness raising and creating solidarity and between different fractions or segments of the population. But it's that same protest that is typically sanitized is not going to be a viral thing. It's a safe form. And what's also interesting is that it doesn't, this protest as spectacle, as sanitized, but still with its efficacies, is not merely just one that doesn't interrupt the quote unquote everyday citizen's everyday life. It also preserves, and this is a minor point, but it taps into something that I still wish I could think more about. It is also non-disruptive with regards to the earnings forecasts or the budgets of businesses. So to me, what's interesting is the way that we want the smooth regularity, the regular flow of life to take place. We don't want political speech to disrupt the everyday flow of people's lives. And we don't want the protests, these justice movements, to disrupt the anticipated and pre-calculated flows of capital. So everyday life ought not to be disrupted by protests, and the everyday flow of commodities ought not to be disrupted. And the non-disruption of these two flows seems to be what constitutes the acceptable forms, the non-criminalizable forms of protest. But precisely, now you remember, because you act like the motivation of this book essentially came from the reckoning with the fact that in the midst of the Black Lives Matter movement, you had all of these state legislators creating statutes that would criminalize forms of protest that precisely shut down freeways, shut down major traffic arteries that were spontaneous, unpremeditated, and therefore also caused economic harms. Like one of the articles that was talking about the protests after Trump's quote unquote Muslim ban in the airports.
Yeah.
So much money was lost because of those protests, right? Like they were anticipating sales and those sales could not happen. And that was a significant disruption in the flow of capital, such that they then passed new laws that would give the police the authority to undermine that protest, such that the everyday flow through the terminal and the everyday flow of capital through it. So bodies and capital, the flow of bodies and the flow of capital ought not be disrupted, because in some way those two are determinative of the common good. The opposition to that is the demand for justice. And so what it seems like our society is doing is trying to seek a balance. How do we find a way to have First Amendment rights while not disrupting the economy and the everyday person's everyday life? Now, so then you have protests that are events. Now, and a protest that seems to be an event is something that gets everybody's attention, right? So we talk about the power of the Arab Spring, right? Yeah. And there's this event, this singular event that happens that spurs this massive revolutionary this movement. I mean, and that seems to be in part what gets criminalized. That the protest as an event that disrupts the flow, that demands that because it disrupts the flow, it demands attention, right? I mean, it's precisely in effect what that agitation in the public mind that Dr. King was talking about. Like, how do we it's precisely the protests that disrupt the flow of capital and bodies that create the tension in society that make apathy and complacency and swiping to the next story impossible. It's when you undermine the everyday that something of justice brings society to a halt. Otherwise, it's just anesthetized, right? That the protest is just another spectacle, right? Like a Pepsi. It's like a Pepsi commercial. Protest becomes a Pepsi commercial, right? And that's why Yeah, that's why that was why I took so much time in the book to try to talk about disillusion. And so I talked about the Women's March in 2017 in the air of Trump's inauguration as a part of the function of protest as persuasive, that the Women's March was trying to persuade the mass of society that rolling back women's rights was not something we wanted to do. It was a persuasive affirmation of a particular commitment. Now, there also seem to be moments when protests are part of a process of disillusion. And I thought that when we have things like the destruction of property, riots, violence, that at that point, we tend to say, okay, so these protesters are criminals, right? They're violating the constitutional framework of the love of property. The reason why I looked at Hobbes. I went back to Hobbes. I mean, John Locke and Rousseau. And I looked at their discourses on disillusion. What dissolves government? What is the cause of the dissolution of government? And for Hobbes, it's the hoi polloi. It's the multitude. You have to control and regulate the multitude so that you have everybody on board. Otherwise, you're going to have disillusion. The Commonwealth will fall into faction and irresolute multitude. So it's interesting. So Hobbes has this big thing about he talks about the dangers of religion in that chapter where he's talking about dissolution. He says the problem with the religious discourse is that it can set itself up as an other authority to the authority of the state, right? And so that's dangerous. Reading books from and reading political treatises of Aristotle or of neighboring countries is dangerous because all of a sudden it infects the people with alterity, an other way of thinking about how the world should be. So disillusion is in the people, and the Leviathan, essentially, or the person in power, must regulate the people such that that external element doesn't infiltrate the other authority. But with John Locke and Rousseau, it's this radical reversal. And I think it's integral to understanding the importance of dissent and protest in modern or Enlightenment democracies. So for John Locke, the cause of disillusion is anarchy in the government. It's when particular individuals who are elected into office betray their duty to represent the interests of the common good and use their position of power to get their own satisfaction, to get their own personal interests met. So that actually introduces what Locke calls anarchy into government. It's not the people. It's the damn people in constituted power, in office, who are subverting the government. So when we're going to talk about the anarchists, for instance, we need to be very mindful that we don't forget the anarchy on the inside of power, right? So John Locke is going to say, when people in power betray their trust, the duty or the burden falls back upon the political community to undermine that regime, that structure, to revise, to redo. The burden goes back to the people. So what's interesting to me, what was revelatory for me, is that he starts thinking about the political community without government. That essentially, we have a political community that can call into question its established order and still be a political community. We don't just go back in this sort of social contract Hobbesian sense to a state of nature.
Right.
We still have this human political community that exists ontologically anterior to government. That's interesting. I became very interested in political ontology doing it. And what's interesting to me is that you have a political community that exists prior to having any rights, because it is the burden of the political community to determine the rights, to determine the laws, to determine the statutes, the nature, the divisions of power, right? And so when there's the abuse of power, when there's anarchy in the system, the people have the duty to revolt. And Locke says, get your gun. So the whole Second Amendment makes sense from reading Locke's chapter on disillusion, because power is corrupt. And the only way for the people to have what they are owed by the social contract is to get those people in power out, or to revamp the system. Rousseau is very similar. I mean, it's a little bit more nuanced, but it's the same move, that the disillusion, the causes of the anarchy of society are in the power structure, not in the people. So you have this interesting, and so to me, the virtue of something like the First Amendment and something like the Second Amendment, I mean, obviously there's, it's very difficult to interpret what the Second Amendment entails, but what we had was a political community forged on the idea of the necessity of the people's power to revolt, the people's power to reject totalitarian, authoritarian, self-interested forms of governance, right? So to me, protest is a fulfillment of that commitment to people's, government by the people, for the people, right? Like that sort of mantra is a fundamental assumption in the sense of protest. So I find it, so for me, there's forms of protest that participate in discourse, that legitimate the state apparatus and speak within the that apparatus. And it's like, hey, we need to agitate the legislators. We need to raise consciousness. So there's like a protest that has power and participates in the spectacle and gets everything planned and organizes. And there's and then those protesters are also activists who are mobile in the local community governance. So it's a multiple protest functions within a multitude of activist commitments. But let me just move. The final move is just to say that when protests like in Ferguson become riots and there is a destruction of property, there is a discourse that wants to criminalize those individuals. But to me, the phenomenological experience they have, I would say a majority of the individuals who participate in riots, is a reckoning with the fact that the system is organized precisely to protect itself, that there is no accountability. And yes, protest is, there are a lot that try to hold accountable. And that's essential. That's what Locke is saying. The foundation of democracy is precisely to make those people who occupy those positions accountable to those they serve. And to the extent that they are not, to the extent that they're anarchistic in the sense of self-serving, then what are the people supposed to do? What are the people of Ferguson supposed to do? It's like this whole social contract has been abandoned. The people in power have annulled the social contract. Locke says, I'm sorry, I'm not trying to make Locke the absolute authority, but it's a really valiant discourse. He's saying, like, the declaration of war against the people is what constituted power does in using governance to effectuate its own private purposes, its own private gains. So in a sense, the war has already been declared prior to the Black Bloc showing up, if you understand, if that makes sense.
So, okay, so I have a few things here. So here's one thing. Is it required, or is it necessary, or should it be, whatever way you want to describe it or ask it, of, if people care about these causes or they care about these things that happen, but they don't want to protest, not because they don't have solidarity, not because they disagree or because of anything like that. It's just not for them, right? they want to be the person, doing the community organizing, or they want to be the person, on Capitol Hill and getting behind the doors, or they want to be the person, whatever. You're seeing as there's a role and a place for different people where not everybody doesn't go and they march, or they go and they have these protests. That's one question. The second piece of that is basically, I guess you could sum it up this way, is are there limits to protest? There's limits where it goes wrong. So I was going to bring up kind of the Black Lives Matter protest in 2020, where a lot of people, and not just people on the right or conservative right, but people even kind of in the middle, even some liberals, I think, were saying, look, burning a car and trashing a Target or someone's mom and pop business just because of whatever may be happening is never okay. Right now, some people would disagree, and some people would say, well, these are reparations, or, oh, this is, right. We've already been under attack. So we have, carte blanche. We can do whatever and say whatever and burn whatever and, anything. So then I guess as an example, but I guess my question for it in the kind of, wide lens of that is, are there limits where it's like, this isn't protest. This is more problematic. Now, I agree. And you mentioned in the book, I don't think criminalizing peaceful protest or organized protest or things of that nature, even if they get, rowdy, or even if it gets, intense, I don't know if that's a right thing to do, to criminalize it, right? You see these people as criminals. That doesn't seem, and at least in the way this country is set up, is that way. But I do wonder, I don't have an answer necessarily, I'm just curious, at what point is there a limit where it's like, yeah, that's not a protest anymore, that's, mob rule, that's mayhem, that's, we're talking about people getting harmed, people's whole businesses and livelihood, even people's businesses within their community, right? I mean, there was in various places in summer 2020, there were Black-owned businesses that were burned down or trashed or looted. They lost their whole, savings and things like that. I mean, this wasn't just, we went to the Prada store and stole a bunch of bags, right? I mean, which again is, I can't go into a Prada store and steal a bag right now because that's a crime, right? That's theft. That's so I guess the question I have with that is what are the limits, or are there limits ever to protesting? And if so, what are those and why?
Okay. So your first question was about what I had stumbled upon earlier, and just trying to say, okay, so there's activism.
Yeah.
And then for a cause, and we could say that there's a role or movement. There's a movement, and activists within that movement can deploy protest as a strategy within the overall goal. Okay, fine. And there's people who are great agitators, and there's people who are great speech makers or letter writers, and they're all working together to accomplish this. And I think all movements utilize as many as they can to unfold to achieve their goal. So I don't try to name protest as exclusive. The only way to make change is through protest. Of course not. But I do in the text. I just want to see it and try to think about it in a way that doesn't simplify it. So again, I'm not attaching the hopes for revolution or change to protest. Okay. Now, so and I would just say that the movement is, I wanted to say like zeitgeist, I know that's a horrible term to use, but at the same time, when you're looking at the Black Lives Matter movement, you can see the way that, or one can hypothesize the way in which protest is important. And then from there, we have these defund the police lines, right? So our culture is trying to reckon with police practices, which is something that is necessary, and they're doing it at a legislative level. Would that legislative reckoning happen without people taking to the streets? Mm-hmm. So protest is part of the movement, but it can be held to be a very pivotal one. Okay, so it's not necessarily just one of many, but it might be something we want to think about as integral to democratic process, as some way exceptional.
Sure.
Okay. The second question you brought up, I think I really only took notes on the second part of it, was I summarized as the victims of history, right? That there are these particular business owners, homeowners who suffer damage. There are people who work for chains, like fast food chains or whatever kind of chains that are damaged. Banks are damaged, and the bankers can't go to work and they lose some money. And I mean, everybody has private interests are hurt in the wake of public interest issue. Now, again, I'm not trying to say that, well, that damage or the suffering to private interest is caused by the self-protective insularity of the police department, right? Of not holding its officers accountable, right? So my understanding is that the Ferguson riots is that there's not even going to be an investigation into the conduct of these officers, mm-hmm. right? And so all of a sudden you have this sense that the system is, I mean, I'm sorry, it's cliche, but it's like rigged, right? That they're not.
I hear Bernie Sanders in my head.
I'm sorry, but I mean, and so there's no accountability. So there's this massive betrayal of the function of government, mm-hmm. is to give us justice. And it's not the particular individual who's doing us injustice, it's the system. And so you have a militarized police force that is like using militarized police force patrolling Ferguson streets. And you have individuals who are enraged that this could be the outcome of all of the agitation, all of the protests, all of the communications and multi-tiered engagement with the police force. It comes to nothing. So you feel like the system is not representing your interests at all. I mean, I can understand from the readings of Locke and Rousseau the tendency to want to destroy vestiges of the social contract, like private property, because it's not now. So I guess I have some tendency to say that we want to live in a world where we are not scathed by the contemporary or by historical processes. And I feel that that's a dangerous expectation, and that it's very difficult for me to say this, but I'm just, I open myself up to such liability, that there is a certain way in which those people who have property damage and don't have insurance, and so it's a real loss to their family, right? And so we want to say, well, justice movements or reactions to systemic injustice should not cause trauma to private individuals. And our media does, right? Left and right, blame the rioters. Mm-hmm. Is it possible to construct a discourse that doesn't blame the rioters? And I think that there is. I think that there is a way to say, yes, private interests suffer when in the real of social justice movement. I think that it's impossible to say that we as a community can have real justice movements that do not have cost and consequences, that don't interrupt the smooth flow of everyday life and capital, right? That there are going to be interruptions. And I think that if we look at revolutions, if we look at revolutionary or protest movements throughout the world, there's always losses. That's the point. The point is we as a people we don't want protest to be an inconvenience. We don't want protest to be a disruption. We want it to be like a sports highlight reel. We want something to scan through. I mean, the whole idea of, there's like this, we're an ahistorical people. Our students don't really know history very well, right? We just kind of have this instantaneous culture. The part of protest that seems integral is its participation in a transgenerational movement. Let me talk about Kant. I know you didn't want to talk about Kant.
Well, yeah, I do, but just one quick point on that. So I'm not trying to pin you down, but so you would say that there's really no limits then to protests in those examples that you're saying. It's like, yeah, I mean, you're this is justified to do these things, and you know what? You got to break a few eggs to make an omelet, kind of thing. Is that kind of the idea? Like, there's no limits. There's no limits.
The point is that we don't want to break any eggs.
Mm-hmm.
And so when the private interest owners shop that has been deployed, I mean, look, we're not talking anti-capitalism here, but the thesis of the text is to a large extent that the common good, when we're passing these laws and we're making these decisions, the common good is predominantly oriented towards the good of the economy. The good of the economy has a lot to do with what we think of as the good of the people. If we have a good economy, the people are happy. If the economy is bad, the people are unhappy. That's a simplification, of course. But to the extent that we start to understand that the criminalization of protest precisely corresponds or often corresponds to moments when they have deleterious consequences for business perspectives and everyday life planners, right? Your plans get interrupted. Your economic forecasts get interrupted. Justice interrupts the smooth flow of the spectacle. It sure does, and it should. And Thoreau is going to say, we need to be a people who's strong enough to understand that justice and fighting and caring or being committed to justice requires losses, sacrifices. I think it doesn't mean that everybody should go trash people's stuff. But look, if you're saying that part of the problem here is the predominance of capitalist interests in setting public policy, you look around and you see all of these capitalist industries, it's hard not to take aim at them to the extent that you see them having their interest weighed above your own. And look, that's a horrible way to conclude that little riff, but I mean, for me, there is something there that the breaking of eggs is necessary, and a political community has to reckon with that. This is genuine change is messy, difficult, and trying. And I think that there's no way to simplify that. And yeah, people are going to get pissed and have aggression. And it's just like, for me, it's understandable. It's so understandable. I have empathy for that. Like, to me, that I can imagine being there and being so pissed off at the system.
Well, it's very interesting. I mean, I will be honest. We do not align here. I don't agree, but I really like hearing the arguments, because your arguments are I think are designed well, and I think that they're a way of saying, like, here's a structure or model of where this is coming from or where this is coming out of. How is there some application here? So, there's definitely a kind of, I would say, kind of cohesive, not narrative, but a structure of how you're explaining it. So,
just to revisit for a second, like that whole point about disillusion is precisely that is important. And if we look at in Ferguson, the rolling in of the militarized police force, the tanks, the weapons, the surveillance system, the whole, who's declared war? To me, oh yeah, these people stole some televisions. For God's sakes, you have like a lot of the rioting happened after the cops rolled in with their federal military equipment. Who's declaring the war? I mean, to me, it's very nice to say like, oh yeah, nobody should lose any private property because that's the sacred thing. To me, point to a revolution, point to genuine social change where people didn't sacrifice their own private interests for something called the common good. I mean, it's I
hear that, and look, to be very clear, I am not in any way defending militarization of our border or police departments or things like that. I think there is absolutely foundational structural issues with the police departments all across this country. There is an absolute huge chasm, huge need for reforming our entire law enforcement, full stop. I mean, so yeah, you're not going to get me defending, any of that side of things as well. So to be clear, but I hear your point. I hear your point about who's kind of throwing the first stone here. I hear that. Okay, but I do want to get to Kant. I know Kant and Spinoza is kind of your kind of wheelhouse too. You can go with this in terms of this topic here. We can still kind of stay on that. Or what would be interesting is talking about Kant about many things about him and where he sits within idealism. If you want to bring in Hegel here, you can just riff off of whatever is floating around in your mind on Kant specifically.
So I wrote in protest. I wrote on Kant, and I wrote on some somewhat minor texts, and obviously the "What is Enlightenment" text served as a easy inroad, where Kant is, of course, advocating for the power to critique, the duty to critique, and to obey. Right, so you can critique the laws, you can critique the protocols of one's church, you can critique the union, but until people are persuaded, you obey, right? And so that makes sense. I mean, in a certain way, that's what we like. You obey the law. We're all lawful citizens. It's all very, circumscribed by, laws and regulations. But you can critique and you can attempt to improve the police force or improve the funding for schools. Okay, so that's cool. Kant's cool like that. What's interesting about that essay and what he does elsewhere is he talks about crimes against humanity. And he says that to the extent that you have a political regime that represses critical discourse, or takes it personally and takes it as an attack against them, and so represses or criminalizes expressions of critique or dissent, that agency, that governance, is itself perpetrating a crime against humanity. And so one of the things that's interesting here is the way that you can start to think about dissent as a human right. And of course, this is problematic because what are human rights? What is their foundation? There's a lot of problems there that we could talk about. But I mean, for me, the idea that he drops out of Kant's or pops out of Kant's apparatus is that the repression of critique, the processes whereby critical discourse is silenced or other discourses are silenced, is a critique of humanity, because he recognizes that critique and dissent serve a function to move our society towards the state, a condition where you have the optimal condition of universal flourishing, right? So he's talking about what ought to be the case is that our society, as an egalitarianism, empowers equally every individual to flourish in their own particular way. And so then any obstruction of critical discourse would serve to interrupt the securement of that condition of collective flourishing. So then one can just read protest as part of this discourse. And Kant is very good because he realizes that real social change takes multiple generations.
Yeah.
And we're still dealing with race. It's not going away. I mean, how many more generations is it going to take for race to really be altered as a function of distribution of social goods? Like, I have no clue, but it's not going to happen in my lifetime, I don't think. So anyways, I can stop there, but you see, like, from within the Kantian discourse, you can articulate the function of protest as contributed to the well-being of humanity, a future transgeneration, and for Kant, transnational project. So Kant is cool because he also sees the possibility of a global, a cosmopolitan Poland. And the idea that what one writes, because Kant is talking about the freedom of the pen, the palladium of the pen, he says, is the world. To quote unquote, mount the stage of the world is to seize the pen. And so you can write a critique of war or a critique of this policy, and it can be translated into different languages. And all of a sudden you have a global discourse on the inadequacies of the collective efforts to mitigate climate change, right? So you can have, so even in the 1880s, when Kant's at his friskiest, you have this idea of a global resistance, the idea of a global activism. But you have to obey in the meantime, right? You have to obey.
Well, I think that the trans kind of national thing is interesting. It's very, very interesting. And I guess the question I have here is that we could maybe kind of stay here. We've mentioned it, we've talked about it, but I guess, and then maybe it's not the right question. I don't know, but is the ability or the act of protesting, is it a right? Is it a human right? Is it a legal right? Is it a cultural right? Is it a right in the way we think of, like, human rights or the rights that people have as individuals, or is it something else, or is it not that? And if it's not a right, where do you think it falls? Or what are your ideas there?
I mean, it seems to be a right within a constituted system, right? So the United States, we have this right.
Yeah.
And that follows from our history, right? That the United States history is such that revolution was necessary to constitute itself, that essentially the country is inaugurated by this radical no saying, right? And so this right is embedded in a particular historical process that is multi-generation. And so I think that, yes, I mean, obviously, any political community can protect the activity of dissent. That, we can make mandates. There shall be no authority that silences the people in issuing grievances, right? Like, there is the right to express dissatisfaction with the way things are, even with Kant, right? Now, where does this right? Yeah, I mean, I asked this question to myself, like, where does this right come from?
Yeah.
I mean, the modern social contract theory that I'm working within, that to a large extent has framed some of the modern democratic constitutions. You say there's a state of nature, and then there's the state of civilization. And we're trying to justify the presumptions of our civilization by reference to the state of nature. So we're almost saying we're deriving these rights from the state of nature. I don't think that I might be wrong, but I don't think that you can derive the right to dissent from a state of nature.
Mm-hmm.
I think that it's a unique function of a constituted political community, right? It's, the colonialists meeting to discuss whether or not they should get the loom fixed this year, right? And there's a majority opinion, but there's still somebody who raises their hand to object, right? And they have their forum, they have their palladium.
And so my question would be: so is this a cultural thing? Is this a way for our humanity of, as we've cohabitated together in certain groups, that it's a cultural right?
That's a great question, and I think that to me that would be really interesting to do a cultural comparative anthropology of conflict resolution, of minority question of the minority's voice, and how does a community protect for the tyranny of the majority. So to me, it is very interesting the way that dissent and the First Amendment are vehicles for the protection of a marginal or a minority. It preserves the democratic process, at least, of egalitarian opportunity to influence policy. So in that sense, it's great. And I think that it would be really interesting to actually do that work of comparing cultures and how they navigate this particular impasse of objection and dissent and disagreement with majoritarian power or majoritarian counsel.
No, I absolutely agree.
So, and then it can get into business management and business models too, like how corporations are structured. So then you get to this sort of hierarchy hypothesis that, a lot of these conflicts are rooted in hierarchical forms of social organization. And then that, to what extent do cultures and communities that are not hierarchically organized have different ways of resolving conflict, because there's not the assumption of a power differential. So it would be interesting for me to look at to what extent is the First Amendment necessary, because there's assumed a radical disparity of power distribution in that community, such that it protects for that. That other communities wouldn't necessarily need.
Yeah. So the last question I have for you is kind of just a open-ended one, which is, I guess, where do you see the role of protests in the future, right? Where are we going, right, in terms of doing this? So I kind of mentioned at the beginning of, we live in a digital age, we're very connected, we're doing a lot of signaling for better, for worse online, and everyone's got their own thing. And, but I guess just where do you see 20 years from now, 50 years from now, 100 years from now, in the 22nd, century, like, just as you look at it, kind of keep going with that thing. And there's maybe a cultural human thing to it, but I guess as we evolve, you can just be near future if you want. Where do you see protesting evolving or going, or their function of it through time?
So I see, we haven't had a chance to talk about the whistleblower, but I see the likelihood of an increased amount of whistleblowing, leaks of classified documents. I think that kind of stuff will be happening more. I think hacktivism will become obviously much more dangerously effective. And so there are different possibilities. I don't claim those two to be extensive. One thing that's interesting to me in researching the consequences of the criminalization of protests is that a lot of times there was this discourse of terrorists, that the protesters are terrorists. And a lot of times, I know it's an old record, but the discourse that justified or legitimated the use of the word terrorist was largely this disruptive function of protest, as disrupting the natural flow of traffic patterns, the predictability of capital flows. So you have this rupture effect of predictable life and the emergence of the discourse of terrorists. And what was interesting to me is being mindful of Guantanamo Bay and the way that the moniker of terrorist legitimates particular operations of power on the body of the protester. So to me, it's very interesting. Giorgio Agamben's analysis of the homo sacer, where you have the exercise of sovereign power, uncheckable power, essentially, because it operates without precedent. This uncheckable power operates upon precisely the body that has been stripped of rights. Much like, so his analysis of the concentration camp is precisely how does sovereign power operate on the bare body, bare life, the life without narrative, the life without rights. And what Agamben is doing is in part equipping thinkers like myself to see the way that when we label a protester a terrorist, we legitimate a particular operation on their body. That means imprisonment, shipping them off to zones or territories where rights don't apply. Right? It gives power an operativity over bodies that I think is very dangerous. And I worry about, I mean, when I was writing this text, I was very worried about the consequences of this discourse that doesn't just criminalize protest, but also names it terror. And that, what the irony was, or what was frustrating, is that I'm sorry, but like the legitimation of the utilization of the word terrorist occurs precisely in correlation to a discourse that sees protests as criminal, i.e. as disrupting the flow of capital. So you see like the danger here. We start to use the word terrorist for the protester when they're disrupting the common good that has been equated with the predominant interests of the economy. So this is why I can become more sympathetic to the rioter who feels like the system is totally deaf to them, taking issue with capital.
Yeah, I mean, for sure. I mean, I think labeling folks that are, engaging in these activities is the terrorism is not a helpful, it's not an accurate term, it's not a helpful term. And I don't think it should be deployed. And I do have some sympathy towards the ideas about against the body and things like that. I can definitely hear that.
Yeah.
I don't think that that's right. And this is kind of, my kind of flattened reductionist view on this is that, extremism begets more extremism, right? So someone's got to up the ante, and then someone's going to up it here, and then up it here, and all of a sudden we're talking about terrorism. It's just like that's not what's going on here. But I am sympathetic with some of that.
Let me see what else I wanted to say. So what else is interesting to me about the future of protest is the existence of the surveillance biometric.
Yeah.
And I was thinking about after this book, I wrote a little paper on the Hong Kong protests in, I think it was 2021, where the presence of biometric surveillance was clear. And the people who were protesting were being identified as protesters, and then the police were coming to their home. And so the protesters started to wear face masks, the anonymous mask. And then it became illegal to wear masks at the protest. So you had to, in order to exercise the right to dissent, one had to show up in one's face. One had to be inscribed within a particular order, the order of that pairs your identity, your biology, your biometric signature is inscribed within the system. So when you participate in the spectacle of everyday life that protest is part of, your biometrics has to be, you consent to, without really being asked, you consent to have your biometric data scanned and appropriated by the system. And this is precisely the value of Edward Snowden, who showed us this moment, and Chelsea Manning, where you have a state apparatus that is saying, no, we do not conduct mass domestic surveillance. And you have an agent on the inside of the NSA saying, yes, we do. And so you have the leak, you have the whistleblower who reveals to the polis, the people, that which is being done in their name that is constitutionally horribly questionable. So I guess I'm just trying to make this conclusion that, the future of protest, and, you're asking about the digital. So the in-person protest cannot be done anonymously. If you utilize the First Amendment right in the future, there's no anonymity. If you go to a protest, your identity is cataloged, right? Like that's got to be the already contemporary situation that might make exercising one's First Amendment rights a problem. So like the individual who has a warrant out for their arrest, right, shows up for the protest, they get recognized on the surveillance system, and then the next day, there's knocks at the person's door. Yeah. So that already the people who are already feeling victimized or exploited or unjustly protected by the system are then motivated to not exercise their First Amendment rights. So to me, the digital hacktivism, I imagine that's going, but see, that too has its signature. So to me, the eclipse of anonymity, the eclipse of being able to express dissent without it being traced back to my consumer habits, what properties I own, my biology and my genetics. All of these things are getting mixed up, and I imagine that 2 generations, or this generation and the next subsequent generations, are going to be thinking about, how do we have consciousness raising? How do we have protest movements in an age without a secret?
No, I agree. Well, the book is called Toward a Philosophy of Protest, Dissent, State Power, and the Spectacle of Everyday Life. Let's see, Lexington Books is putting this out. Is that what it is? Where can people find this?
They did that.
Yeah.
They didn't include the good table of contents, the full table of contents, which you can find on my on my website. Yeah. And
I was going to ask, where can people find you or your work or anything you've written?
There's nowhere. I've time to burn all of it. That's okay. So good luck finding.
Well, hopefully people enjoyed this conversation. Yeah, I certainly have enjoyed it. It was a fantastic conversation. It was really, really thought-provoking. I really, really enjoyed it. So thank you for coming on.
Thanks, Xavier. I appreciate it very much.
All right.